Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The brown envelope slid across the mahogany desk of the Goldstein and Associates law firm in Boston, Massachusetts. James Mitchell looked at the document with a mixture of sadness and determination. The death of his grandfather, Howard Mitchell, still weighed heavily on his heart. But the contents of that envelope represented much more than just an inheritance. It was a family legacy going back 3 generations. As you can see, Mr. Mitchell, the property in Wellesley Hills is registered entirely in your name now, explained Richard Goldstein, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses. Your grandfather was very specific about that. The mansion at 42 Woodland Street is to remain in the Mitchell family. James ran his fingers over the cover of the document, thinking of all the stories his grandfather had told about the house built in 1892, the 3-story Victorian mansion had been the pride of the family since his great-grandfather acquired it in 1925. He remembered summers spent there exploring the ornate hallways and the meticulously maintained garden. There's something else you need to know, Goldstein hissed, his expression turning serious. Over the last few months, we've had several attempts to buy the property through the local homeowners association. All were turned down by your grandfather, of course. James frowned. HOA, since when do they have the authority to broker property sales? That's exactly the problem, Goldstein replied, removing another document from the folder. The president of the HOA, Patricia Whitmore, has been particularly insisting your grandfather kept detailed records of all interactions with her. The young businessman examined his grandfather's meticulous notes. Over the past 2 years, Patricia had tried various ways to pressure Howard Mitchell into selling the property, from dubious fines for alleged HOA code violations to attempts to devalue the property through rumors about its structural condition. I'm afraid the situation could get complicated, Goldstein continued. Ms. Whitmore is not known for taking no for an answer, especially when it comes to new homeowners who are not part of her preferred social circle. James smiled slightly, recognizing the insinuation of 32. He had built his own tech company from scratch, but was still seen as an outsider by the old Wellesley Hills elite. Well, then I guess it's time to pay the property a visit. The next morning, James drove his Tesla Model 3 through the ornate gates of the Mitchell Mansion, Ottoman, Massachusetts, painted the century-old trees in shades of red and gold, creating a dramatic contrast with the Victorian facade in shades of teal and cream. As he parked, he noticed a group of people in the front garden. A woman of about 60, wearing a Chanel ensemble and pearls that practically screamed old wealth, gestured animatedly at a well-dressed couple. As you can see, the property retains all its historic charm, she said in an affected tone. With a few modern renovations, of course, it could become the jewel of the neighborhood. Again, the Mitchells clearly didn't have the resources to maintain it properly in recent years. James felt his blood boil, but kept his composure as he approached the group. Excuse me, can I help you? Patricia Whitmore, for it could only be your turn, with a rehearsed smile that froze when she noticed his presence. And you would be James Mitchell, the owner, he replied calmly, holding out his hand. And you must be Patricia Whitmore. My lawyer mentioned that you had an interest in the property. Her smile faltered for a moment before she pulled herself together. Yes, the grandson. What a pleasant surprise. I was just showing the Hendersons the potential of the property. You know, for the good of the community, we need to ensure that this historic house remains in proper hands. Proper, James arched an eyebrow, keeping his tone cordial. Like the hands of the family that built and maintained it for almost a century. The Henderson couple exchanged uncomfortable glances before muttering apologies and hurrying off. Patricia narrowed her eyes, all pretense of cordiality disappearing. Listen to me, Mr. Mitchell, this community has standards to maintain. Your grandfather may have been tolerated for historical reasons, but modern times demand a modern approach. I'm sure we can come to an agreement that benefits everyone. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, but the mansion is not for sale, James replied firmly. And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop acting as if you're authorized to market it. You don't understand how things work here, she hissed, stepping closer. This property represents a crucial element in the planned development of our community. It would be a shame if administrative problems started to arise, fines for code violations, frequent inspections, that sort of thing. James smiled, removing his phone from his pocket. Interesting you should mention that. You know, my grandfather was a very meticulous man. Every interaction, every veiled threat, every attempt at manipulation, everything is documented, including this conversation I've just recorded. Patricia's face paled slightly, but she maintained her rigid posture. Are you threatening me, Mr. Mitchell? No, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm just setting clear boundaries. Mitchell Manor will remain with the Mitchells, and any future attempts at coercion will be dealt with through the appropriate legal channels. As he watched Patricia walk away with stiff steps, James gazed at the mansion that was now officially his responsibility. The late afternoon shadows danced across the colorful stained glass windows, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw his grandfather smiling through one of the second-floor windows. This wouldn't just be a battle for property, it would be a fight for his family's legacy, and the principles his grandfather had always stood for, and James Mitchell was more than prepared to face it. James spent the next morning inspecting every room in the mansion meticulously, documenting the state of the property with photos and notes. Against Patricia Whitmore's claims, the house was in excellent condition, a testament to her grandfather's dedicated care. As she organized her makeshift office in the second-floor library, a firm knock echoed through the front door. On the other side, he found a middle-aged woman with gray hair and a genuine smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Margaret Chun. I live in the blue house across the street." She introduced herself, offering a pan of homemade cookies. "Your grandfather used to help me with the garden. He was an extraordinary man." James felt an immediate sense of relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Chin. Please come in the vintage kitchen, now updated with modern appliances." Margaret shared stories about Howard Mitchell and, more significantly, Patricia Whitmore. "She took over as president of the HOA 5 years ago," Margaret explained, stirring her tea. "Since then, 3 families have been practically forced to move out. The Ramirezes were the last absurd fines for non-existent infractions until they couldn't take it anymore, and no one opposes it." Margaret sighed. "Patricia has powerful connections on the city council. Besides, most of the older residents are on her side. They believe that preserving the historic character of the neighborhood means maintaining a certain demographic profile." Before James could respond, his phone vibrated. It was a notification from the security camera app he had installed the night before. On the screen, he saw 2 men in Wellesley Municipal Services uniforms inspecting the perimeter of the property. "Interesting," muttered James, checking his email. "No official notification of any inspection today." Margaret frowned. "Patricia often uses her connections to carry out surprise inspections. That's how it started with the Ramirezes." James walked down to the garden, finding the men photographing the historic wrought iron fence. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The taller of the 2 snorted nervously. "Routine inspection, sir. There have been a complaint about possible structural violations." "Really? And may I see the official inspection order?" The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Well, actually, let me guess, Patricia Whitmore sent them." James smiled, removing his phone. "Interesting that they're wearing municipal uniforms for an unauthorized inspection. I'm sure the city council's legal department would find that fascinating." The inspectors hurried off, leaving James with a momentary feeling of victory, but he knew that this was only the beginning. Back in the library, James began an in-depth search. He discovered that Patricia had orchestrated a series of strategic acquisitions in the neighborhood, always following the same pattern: systematic pressure on homeowners through the HOA, followed by the purchase of the properties for below market value by investors connected to her. "Mr. Mitchell," Margaret's voice brought him back to the present. "There's something you need to see." She held out a tablet showing the local news website. The headline made his blood boil. "Historic mansion at risk, security concerns at Mitchell Estate." The article clearly quoted anonymous sources expressing concern about the structural state of the mansion and questioning the new owner's ability to properly maintain it. "She's trying to devalue the property," Margaret commented. "She did the same with the others." James nodded, an idea taking shape. "Mrs. Chin, you mentioned that other families have been forced out. Would you be able to put me in touch with them?" Over the next few hours, James built up a network of contacts with former and current residents unhappy with Patricia's management. Each story revealed a clearer pattern of manipulation and abuse of power. In the evening, while going through the documents left by his grandfather, he found something intriguing: original blueprints showing that part of the land Patricia claimed as HOA common area was actually legally owned by the Mitchells. His phone rang. It was Richard Goldstein. "James I just received a notice. Patricia has called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. The main topic is a proposed historic renovation which conveniently would start with your property." "Perfect," James replied, a plan solidifying in his mind. "Time to show Mrs. Whitmore that she's not the only one who knows how to play this game." As night fell over Wellesley Hills, James organized his strategy. Shadows danced through the halls of the mansion, and he could feel the weight of family history on his shoulders. His grandfather had resisted Patricia's attempts for years. Now it was his turn to not only resist, but to end her reign of terror over the neighborhood once and for all. On the wall of the library, his grandfather's portrait seemed to look at him approvingly. James knew that the real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since he had arrived he felt truly prepared for what was to come. The meeting room at the Wellesley Hills Community Center was packed that night. James Mitchell watched from the back row as Patricia Whitmore, in her typical Chanel ensemble, commanded the HOA meeting with her usual rehearsed authority. The buzz ceased when she banged the gavel, starting the proceedings. Our first agenda tonight is the proposed historic renovation of the neighborhood, Patricia announced, projecting slides that showed planned improvements to various properties. As you can see, we'll be starting with the Mitchell Mansion, which has unfortunately been showing worrying signs of deterioration. James smiled discreetly as he noticed Margaret Shun and other neighbors he had contacted in the last 24 hours strategically positioned around the room. The plan was in motion. Before we go any further, James stood up, his calm but firm voice echoing around the room. I'd like to make a few points. Patricia could barely disguise her irritation. Mr. Mitchell, we have a procedure to follow. New owners need to wait 6 months before Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws, James interrupted her gently, states that homeowners may make emergency presentations when their property is the primary focus of the agenda. I'm sure you as president are familiar with the rules. A murmur of approval ran through the room. James walked to the front, connecting his laptop to the projector. First, I'd like to present the complete structural report of Mitchell Mansion, carried out 3 weeks ago by a certified company. The images showed detailed technical studies proving the excellent condition of the property. As you can see, any concerns about the structural integrity are unfounded. Patricia tried to intervene, but James continued. Secondly, I discovered something interesting in the property's historical records. He projected the original blueprints. This area that the HOA has been claiming is common. It's been legally owned by the Mitchell estate since 1925. Patricia's face paled visibly. James could see her mind calculating the implications. Years of improperly collected fees, decisions made without legal authority. But more importantly, James continued, it's a pattern that needs to be discussed. He projected a documented timeline. In the last 5 years, 7 families have been forced to sell their properties below market value after systematic harassment campaigns through the HOA. Margaret Shun stood up. The Ramirezes were fined weekly for violations that didn't exist. I have photos proving that. Their yard was in perfect condition. Other residents began to speak up, sharing similar experiences. James watched Patricia try to keep her composure as her house of cards began to crumble. And finally, James projected public bank documents. All of these properties were purchased by shell companies that, interestingly enough, have direct connections to HOA board members. The room erupted in excited conversation. Patricia banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to regain control. That's defamation. I'm suing. Actually, a strong voice sounded from the entrance to the room. You won't. Richard Goldstein entered, accompanied by 2 FBI agents. Patricia Whitmore, we have some questions about certain real estate transactions and possible mail fraud. The ensuing chaos was almost cinematic. Patricia tried to leave through the side door, but was intercepted. James watched as she was escorted out, her mask of superiority finally crumbling. Hours later, sitting in the mansion's library, James received visits from grateful neighbors. Margaret Shun served tea in old porcelain cups that had belonged to her grandmother. Your grandfather would have been proud, she commented, looking at the portrait of Howard Mitchell. He always said that you had inherited not only his name, but his integrity. James nodded thoughtfully. The mansion was never just about the property itself. It was about doing the right thing, about protecting not just our history, but that of the whole community. Through the window he could see the gardens illuminated by the twilight. In the coming weeks, there would be a lot of work ahead, reorganizing the HOA, helping damaged families seek redress, restoring the true spirit of community that Patricia had destroyed. But that night, watching the neighbors share stories and laughter in the library his grandfather loved so much, James knew he had taken the first step in the right direction. Mitchell Manor wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of resistance against injustice, and a reminder that some things are worth fighting to preserve. The morning after the tumultuous HOA meeting, James found a pile of mail on his doorstep, letters of support from neighbors and former residents of the neighborhood, each containing more evidence of Patricia Whitmore's questionable practices. As he organized the documents in his library, a familiar knock sounded at the door. Richard, James greeted his lawyer, noticing his grave expression. From your face, I imagine the news isn't good. It depends on your point of view, replied Goldstein, placing a folder on the table. Patricia was released on bail this morning, and I've just received this, a subpoena She's suing you for defamation, claiming damages to your reputation in the amount of $5 million. James smiled, surprising his lawyer. Exactly as we expected, Margaret. Margaret Chin emerged from the kitchen with a tray of coffee. The documents you asked for are all here, she said, handing over a flash drive. 10 years of HOA financial records that my late husband kept while he was treasurer. Patricia never knew we kept copies. Perfect, James nodded. What about the others? As if answering his question, the doorbell rang. At the door stood Robert Ramirez, his wife Elena, and 3 other former residents who had been forced to sell their homes. Each carried folders and storage devices containing their own evidence against Patricia Senior Mitchell. Elena began, her voice carrying years of hurt. When we lost our house, we thought we were alone, that no one would believe us against someone like Patricia Whitmore. James led everyone into the living room, where a makeshift war room had been set up. On the walls, maps of the neighborhood marked the properties Patricia had managed to acquire through her pressure tactics. On a side table, laptops displayed financial spreadsheets and records of suspicious transactions. What Patricia doesn't understand, James explained to the group, is that her power has always depended on isolating her victims. She would attack one family at a time, ensuring that no one noticed the pattern. But now we have a community united against her. Margaret added. Richard Goldstein examined the new documents with growing interest. This is extraordinary. We have evidence of tax evasion, manipulation of public records, and possible money laundering through front companies, not to mention the recordings, added Robert Ramirez, playing an audio on his cell phone, in which Patricia explicitly threatened her family with deportation if they didn't sell their house. While the group worked on organizing the evidence, James received an urgent message from one of the investigators he had hired. The findings were even deeper than they had imagined. Patricia was not acting alone. Her network of influence extended to city officials and some members of the city council. We need to be strategic, warned Goldstein. People like Patricia Whitmore don't fall easily. They have resources, connections, and nothing to lose, added James, which means she's going to attack with everything she's got. As if to prove his point, James' cell phone vibrated with a notification from the security system on the external cameras. A team of municipal inspectors, accompanied by police officers, were approaching the mansion. Emergency inspection order, announced one of the officers as James opened the door. We've received reports of critical building code violations that pose an imminent risk. James smiled, signaling for them to enter. Please make yourselves at home. Richard, could you show them the full structural certification we obtained last week? And Margaret, how about sharing those interesting photos from the previous inspections? The next few minutes were a spectacle of calculated professionalism. Each accusation was methodically refuted with appropriate documentation. Each attempt to find violations was confronted with meticulous maintenance records and prior approvals. Oh, and before you leave, James called out to the inspectors, we'd like to formally file a complaint about misuse of municipal authority for private persecution. I'm sure the State Attorney General's office will find it interesting how certain inspections have been systematically targeting specific properties. After the inspection team left, the group resumed their work with renewed determination. The next few hours were dedicated to building not only a defense against Patricia's lawsuit, but a comprehensive counterattack that would expose the full extent of her manipulative network. The next move will be hers, observed Margaret as night began to fall. And knowing Patricia, it will be something big. James gazed at the portrait of his grandfather on the library wall. You know what my grandfather always said? The truth doesn't fear the light of day. Patricia built her empire in the shadows, manipulating people through fear and isolation. Our strength lies precisely in bringing everything to light, while the others took their leave, promising to return the next day to continue their work. James remained in the library, reviewing every document, every piece of evidence, every piece of the puzzle that revealed the true extent of the corruption that Patricia had built up in Wellesley Hills. The mansion, silent, except for the occasional creak of its centuries-old timbers, seemed to vibrate with renewed energy, as if the house itself witness to so many stories over the decades approved of the battle being fought in the name of justice and community. The next day promised new challenges, but for the first time since this whole situation began, James felt that they had something more powerful than any influence Patricia could exert: the strength of a community, united in search of the truth. The sun was rising over Wellesley Hills as a series of police cars parked in front of Mitchell Manor. James watched through the library window as federal agents loaded boxes of Documents from Patricia Whitmore's personal office, the operation he had helped build over the last few weeks, was finally reaching its climax. "The evidence is overwhelming," commented Special Agent Maxwell, spreading files out on the mahogany desk. "We've uncovered an elaborate money laundering scheme using the properties acquired through the HOA. Patricia wasn't just forcing people to sell, she was using the houses to clean money from a real estate cartel." James nodded, recalling the endless nights analyzing documents with his makeshift team of neighbors and former residents, and the city officials involved. "3 counselors and the works secretary have already been arrested this morning," Maxwell replied. "But there's something else you need to know." The agent slid a folder marked "Confidential" across the table. Inside, James found something that made his heart squeeze: old photos of his grandfather confronting Patricia dating back almost a decade. Howard Mitchell not only resisted her attempts to acquire this property, Maxwell explained, he was building a case against her. The meticulous documentation he kept is what allowed us to connect all the dots. The revelation struck James like a thunderbolt. His grandfather hadn't just preserved the mansion, he was fighting a silent battle against the corruption that threatened the entire community. Margaret Chen entered the library, carrying a tray of fresh coffee. "The news is spreading fast," she reported. "Several former residents are already organizing to sue the HOA and get their properties back." James' phone rang. It was Richard Goldstein. "You need to see this," said the lawyer, sending a video link. On the screen, a visibly dejected Patricia Whitmore faced a crowd of reporters on the steps of the federal courthouse, her usual Chanel ensemble replaced by more modest clothes, her once haughty posture now bowed under the weight of the charges. "My clients are prepared to cooperate fully with the investigations," her lawyer announced as Patricia tried to hide her face from the cameras. "I never imagined we would get this far," commented Elena Ramirez, who had arrived with other former residents to follow developments. "When we lost our house, we thought it was the end." James smiled, observing how his library had been transformed into a makeshift operations center with neighbors and investigators working side by side. "It's not about a single house or family," he replied. "It's about restoring the true meaning of community." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. More residents showed up, bringing new evidence and stories. A team of pro bono lawyers offered to represent the aggrieved families. The district attorney announced a special task force to investigate similar cases in other neighborhoods. In the afternoon, an emergency assembly was called at the community center. The room was packed with faces both familiar and new, including many of the former residents who had been forced out. "The reign of terror is over," declared Margaret, now elected interim HOA president. "It's time to rebuild our community based on mutual respect and transparency." James watched as plans were made to help families recover their properties, to revise and reformulate the association's rules, to create mechanisms to protect against future abuses. In the evening, alone in the mansion, James found an old letter in his grandfather's study addressed to him, but never sent. "Dear James, if you are reading this, it means that the battle I started is now in your hands. This mansion is not just a building of wood and glass, it is a symbol of resistance against those who confuse power with right. I trust you will understand this when the time comes. Love, Grandpa Howard." Silent tears streamed down James' face as the realization hit him. His grandfather had prepared the ground for this victory long before he inherited the estate. The mansion wasn't just a physical legacy, it was a mission, a calling to protect not just a house, but the principles of justice and community that it represented. Through the library window, James could see lights coming on in the neighboring houses. Where there had once been fear and isolation, there was now a palpable sense of renewal and hope. Mitchell Manor, which for so long had been a lonely bastion against Patricia Whitmore's tyranny, had now become a symbol of community unity and renewal. "Mission accomplished, Grandpa," whispered James, putting the letter away. Fondly, the sun was setting over Wellesley Hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as if nature itself were celebrating the beginning of a new era for that long-oppressed community. The battle for Mitchell Manor was over, but its true legacy was just beginning.